Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Russian spies in Ukraine and how a biblical story is connected to the art of uncovering and unmasking enemy spies. There are, of course, Russian spies all over Ukraine. We would expect no less. They scout and they report back to their superiors. And sometimes they're caught. Sometimes their cover, as they say in B-movies, is blown. Ukrainians have figured out how to ferret out many of the Russian spies wandering around their country. And their trick, the litmus test to discover who is a real Ukrainian and who is a fake, is as far from high-tech as anyone can possibly imagine. They use the ancient biblical tool called shibboleth. While the languages spoken in Russia and Ukraine are similar, there are significant differences. Note, for example, the phonetic spelling of the first names of the respective leaders of both countries. They carry the same name, yet they spell their names phonetically and pronounce them very differently. It's a nuance, but it's different. For instance, Vladimir Putin versus Vladimir Zelensky. Sounds are automatic giveaways because of the different emphasis given to certain vowel consonant collections in Ukrainian versus Russian. And so Ukrainians use a shibboleth involving the name of a popular, once seasonal, now common bread. The name is palyansia. Russians cannot pronounce the name of the bread. They try, but they can't pronounce it. It doesn't come tripping off their tongues. And if they could say it once, they can't say it 3 times in a row fast. And they've been outed, caught, uncovered. The fluffy loaf of bread catches spies in Ukraine just like a lie detector. A shibboleth is like a password. During World War II, U.S. soldiers used a shibboleth of their own. They would test suspects on the all-American sport of baseball. Baseball was the game every red-blooded American was supposed to know about. If someone couldn't explain a suicide bunt or a knuckler, it raised serious warning flags. A spy might have perfect American accents, yet without a keen understanding of insider baseball, they could not pass that all-American test. So what was the first shibboleth and where did it all start? Well, actually it started with an actual shibboleth. In the biblical book of Judges, chapter 12, the Ephraimites crossed the river Jordan and attacked the Gilead, which is located at the nexus of the Yabok and Jordan rivers. Gilead repelled the invasion under the leadership of Yiftach. And the Ephraimites were uncovered as spies because the Ephraimites could not easily pronounce the shin in the word shibboleth. Instead of shin, they pronounced it sibboleth, using the sin sound. And in Judges 12, 5-6, soldiers of Gilead intercepted the Ephraimites crossing back over the Jordan River and asked them to say shibboleth. If they could not say it, they were killed. All in all, 42,000 Ephraimites were killed. The Bible tells the story in chapter 12. Here it is, quote, "And the Gileadites took the passages of the Jordan before the Ephraimites. So when the Ephraimites, which were escaping, said, 'Let me go over,' the men of Gilead should ask, 'Art thou Ephraimites?' If he says no, then tell him, 'Say shibboleth.' And if he says sibboleth, he could not pronounce it correctly. Then they took him and killed him at the Jordan crossings. And 42,000 Ephraimites were killed there," unquote. The word they were asked to pronounce, the word which is now defines who is a native and who is not, who is a spy and who is not, is a simple Hebrew meaning of the top of a stalk of grain. Wheat, rye, corn. In Hebrew, the part of the stalk which is harvested is the shibboleth, right at the very top. Many languages have these tells when speaking another language. One needs to work very hard to overcome them in different languages. A native Arabic speaker, for example, naturally says bolis when referring to police. They need to practice and work hard to say the hard P in police. And that difficulty is the reason the beautiful oasis in northern Israel is called Banyas. The site was dedicated to the Greek god of the wild and nature of spontaneity, Pan, who was often depicted with his flute. This site should be called Panyas, but locals, Arabs, could not pronounce it. So it's called Banyas. Some accents and speakers of particular languages have difficulty transitioning into Hebrew also. In Hebrew, let's say, for instance, every word is pronounced mil-ra. The emphasis is on the last syllable. When the emphasis is not at the end of the syllable, Then there are exceptions to that rule, and that's called milel. Many Spanish speakers have difficulty with milel. It's their automatic tell. Regional accents are also clues as to a person's origin. Any American can immediately tell if someone's family lived in the city of Baltimore for many generations, and if they're newer to arrive in Baltimore. If you lived in Baltimore for many generations, you dropped the TI and you called it Balmer. The world around us is ever-changing, warfare included. It's nice to know that some things remain constant, and the Bible still plays an ever-important role, even in modern warfare. Spies are not the only thing I've been thinking about vis-a-vis the Russian invasion into Ukraine. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is wrong, it's illegal, it's to be condemned at every level. The human tragedy, the senseless targeting, the killing of innocent civilians is a violation of international law. They are war crimes, there's no question. Documenting each dastardly deed, counting each incident of death, recording the destruction are essentials. They're empowering us, the living, to remember and honoring those innocents who were killed and those landmarks that were destroyed. Memory is important. I know and I hope that Putin will stand trial and be punished for his actions. Whether his underlings and commanders will be held accountable is a big question. It's too soon and too fresh for us to know exactly. Accountability and justice depend on several issues. Determination is always made after the fact. One thing I do know with certainty is that Vladimir Putin and his minion army in Ukraine is vastly different from other invasions. Certainly, there are a handful of parallels with the Holocaust, but only a handful. As the Allies were tightening their noose and the war was all but over, Hitler committed suicide in his famous bunker alongside his paramour, Eva Braun. After the war, there were a handful of other trials. The Nuremberg trial was the most famous. The Soviets held a few trials of their own. By and large, however, war criminals were not held accountable for what they did during the Holocaust. And while Israel began a search for Nazis who were responsible for monstrous acts of mass murder, the search was laborious and took a very long time. The Eichmann trial comes to mind. So Holocaust does not offer us clues as to why this time, this invasion by Putin into Ukraine is so very different. The most important difference is that people are aware of what is happening in a world far away, far from them, both geographically and politically. The world is watching. Powerful people are watching, minute by minute, hour by hour, incident after incident. They are getting involved, and they are helping to protect the victims. One can and should argue that more can and should be done. Yet help is arriving for Ukraine and for embattled Ukrainians and Ukrainian refugees. It's what good people do. They forge ahead and they help. Why does the world, especially the United States, care about this atrocity perpetrated by Putin on Ukraine? Even with all the attention this invasion is generating, the overwhelming majority of Americans still cannot find Ukraine on an unmarked map. 8 years ago, when Putin walked into eastern Ukraine and also captured Crimea, the world, the United States included, remained virtually uninvolved and certainly silent. They knew it was happening. They did not get involved. The entire episode from Russia's first invasion of Crimea on February 20th to its annexation on March 25th lasted 1 month and 6 days. And on March 29th, Crimea switched its clock from Crimean time to Moscow time. The head of the Ukrainian Navy in Crimea defected to Russia. So did most of the Ukrainian army that had been stationed in Crimea. 1 Russian soldier and 2 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. That's it. Over 16,000 Ukrainian soldiers and civilian employees defected to Russia. Russia's taking of Donbass, which is the region composed of Donetsk and Luhansk, took a little longer. But again, very few people paid any attention around the world. Preparations for this invasion began in April and June of 2014. From July through September, Russia thoroughly outclassed, outfought Ukraine in the Donbass region. During the battle, about 400,000 Ukrainians were internally displaced. That means they moved. They moved westward to safer places in Ukraine, far away, they thought, from Russian reach. And nobody paid attention at the time. No one volunteered to help. The reasons this war, right now, This invasion, this violation of the rules of war, has caught the attention of the world, and the United States can be explained with two words. And those words are Vladimir Zelensky. We care because the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, makes us care. Zelensky is a dynamic, telegenetic, popular personality who is taking his cause to the world and to the attention of world leaders and to everyday citizens as well. And he is aided by a far more streamlined media than existed in 2014. Today, people care and are more attuned to paying attention to interruptions on their smartphones. They're accustomed to watching 7-second videos, news snippets, and reading 2 lines of a headline. Fundamentally, people, especially Americans, are decent and moral at the core, and they are repulsed by Putin's decisions to indiscriminately bomb and kill Ukrainians and to destroy cities filled with innocent civilians. Putin is an archetypical arch-villain. Putin is the quintessential evil character. The Russian president makes it very easy to side with Zelensky and with Ukraine. Almost no one sides with Russia. When one side is so obviously wrong and evil, it unites those who care. The issue becomes not whether to help, but how to best help, how to most effectively get the assistance to where it needs to go. Unfortunately for Ukraine, Putin is using the models he created in Donbass and Crimea as his guide. In that way, his calculus is very simple. Vladimir Putin wants all or nothing. Vladimir Putin will continue to pound Ukraine until he gets what he wants. That will be the case until a new model emerges. And only Vladimir Zelensky, during his lifetime or after his death, can make that happen. Coming up next, points of view. First up is an analysis piece from Associated Press. It was published on March 17th. The AP does not have opinion pieces. They have analysis. And for our purposes, it's the same thing. AP claims that they stand by all that it's published. So what? It's unauthored. I want to see a name. I want to read others who wrote what they wrote. I want to see the context of the writer. That's why I have such problems with, let's say, Time and The Economist. They hid behind anonymity all the time. It was cowardice, not professional. And in the end, very few places today publish without bylines and names. So AP should actually have names on their editorials. Just editorials are different. But editorials, we actually have an editorial board and an address. This piece is called Who's a War Criminal and Who Gets to Decide? Analysis. Biden flatly called Russia's Putin a war criminal for unfolding Ukraine onslaught. But what are the criteria to qualify as such? And what are the penalties for violating international conventions during a conflict? That's the title. The entire issue is subsumed under the title and subtitle. Suffice it to say, it is a process that takes time to officially declare a person a war criminal. This is how the AP analysis begins. President Joe Biden on Wednesday flatly called Russia's Vladimir Putin a war criminal for unfolding onslaught in Ukraine, where hospitals and maternity wards have been bombed. But declaring someone a war criminal is not as simple as just saying the words. There are set definitions and processes for determining who's a war criminal, and they should be punished. The White House had been avoiding applying the designation to Putin, saying it requires investigation and international determination. After Biden used the term, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said the president was speaking from his heart and renewed her statements that there is a process for making a formal determination. In popular usage, though, the phrase has taken on a colloquial meaning as a generic term for someone who's awful. To clarify the matter, AP finds an expert, and their expert said, clearly Putin is a war criminal, but the president is speaking politically on this, said David Crane, who has worked on war crimes for decades and served as the chief prosecutor for the UN Special Court in Sierra Leone, which tried former Liberian President Charles Taylor. AP continues to ask and answer the question. We're at the beginning of the beginning, said Crane. He predicted an indictment of Putin could happen within a year, but there is no statute of limitations. Here's a look at how it all works. The term applies to anyone who violates a set of rules adopted by world leaders known as the law of armed conflict. The rules govern how countries behave in times of war. Now there are the crimes themselves, and here they are. Here are some of them, let's say. Other than war crimes include deliberately targeting civilians, using disproportionate force, using human shields, taking hostages. The International Criminal Court also prosecutes crimes against humanity committed in the context of widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population. These include murder, extermination, forcible transfer, torture, rape, and sexual slavery. But what about justice? How is that meted out? That too is important. It's normally a public trial in The Hague at the World Court and then sentencing in prison. This is how the AP ends their piece, giving recent examples of justice. Former Yugoslav leader Slobodan Milosevic was put on trial by the UN in The Hague for fomenting bloody conflicts as Yugoslavia crumbled in the early 1990s. He died in a cell before the court could reach a verdict. His Bosnian Serb ally, Radovan Karadžić, and Bosnian Serb military leader, General Ratko Mladić, were successfully prosecuted and are both now serving life sentences. Liberian Taylor was sentenced to 50 years after being convicted of sponsoring atrocities in neighboring Sierra Leone. Chad's former dictator, Hissène Habré, who died last year, was the first former head of state to be convicted of crimes against humanity by an African court. He was sentenced to life. The point of the AP piece is to lay out the procedure. Putin will eventually succumb and will need to present himself to The Hague. It's just a matter of time. Next up is a column from the Jerusalem Post. It was published on March 20th, 2022. It's entitled, "The Fallout of Israel Speaking Up Late About the Iran Nuclear Deal." Editorial, subtitled, "Israel hasn't lost its voice when speaking up about the Iran deal, but if it's whispering, other states won't mind the objections." This is an editorial which means, as we just noted, that the authors' names, we know who they are, we have an address, we know who the editorial board is. The editorial speaks about strategy and the Iranian deal. Their point is not to shout too loud, but to whisper so that countries will actually pay attention and they could get their support. This editorial is critical of behaviors and policies. It offers a suggestion and a different policy to help protect the Middle East and really the world. This is how it begins. On Friday, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid broke their long silence on Iran and admonished U.S. President Joe Biden for considering removing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from the list of foreign terrorist organizations. We find it hard to believe that the IRGC's designation as a terrorist organization will be removed in exchange for a promise not to harm Americans, the two politicians said. The fight against terrorism is a global one, a shared mission of the entire world. We believe that the United States will not abandon its closest allies in exchange for empty promises from terrorists, they said. It was a refreshing statement that showed that Israel had not completely lost its voice in the fight against the coming Iran deal and the concessions that are being planned, which will strengthen and bolster the Islamic Republic. It came after weeks of quiet about the Islamic Republic, during which Israeli leaders occasionally spoke out against it, but almost never mentioned the talks in Vienna or Biden's race to return to the 2015 deal. All this is happening because the U.S. wants a deal with Iran, but Israel needs to protect itself. The piece continues. After all, no one really believes that Iran will forfeit its desire to obtain nuclear capability or will suddenly cease to support for violent terrorist proxies in the Middle East. It's just about kicking the can down the road. And if the world can do that now and not to have to think about Iran for some time, then so be it. The Jerusalem Post's editorial concludes with the following. Israel has no choice but to stand, even on its own, as the voice of reason throughout this process. This is not so it can later tell people, we told you so, but because it needs even now to hold up a mirror for the world and explain what the consequences of its actions will be. This is so true and so important. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show 6 cartoons today. The first cartoon is part of the COVID getting healthy humor shtick. It's all over the place. A person is entering a gym with the sign that reads, and there's a sign that reads outside the gym, "Exercise class, please wear loose-fitting clothing." The person mutters, "If I had loose-fitting clothing, I wouldn't need this class." The next is a perfect dig at Putin. One of his generals tells Putin that Biden called you a war criminal. Putin responds, he should know by now that flattery will get him nowhere. That's a dig at Putin. This next cartoon is a wonderful play on the famous Kilroy Was Here, a World War II cartoon graffiti created by US GIs that appeared in all sorts of places and was tagged Kilroy Was Here. This cartoon, we see a Russian tank emblazoned with the letter Z. The tank is bombed out, and now there's graffiti on it. The graffiti reads, Zelensky was here. The Z of the tank actually serves as the Z for Zelensky's name. Another tank cartoon. On the first panel, we see a Russian tank that shoots and hits the Ukrainian flag on a flagpole. The next panel shows the tank and the Ukrainian flag, which is still flying even though the flagpole was hit and is no longer there. This third tank cartoon has a Ukrainian putting his finger in the barrel of the Russian tank, and the tank blows up. The idea is that Ukraine is using simple tools to destroy the tanks and heavy armor of Russia. These are cartoons, but the highlight is the resilience and the resourcefulness of the people of Ukraine. Finally, this last piece is actually a tweet. It was composed by a tweeter named Socrates. He tweets, I don't know, man. I'm beginning to think that maybe the ruling elite aren't as wise as they claim to be. I can certainly attest to that. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Open Hands is the name of a hacker group, and on Telegraph, an online messaging platform that quickly deletes messages once they have been opened, Open Hands published the private details of the head of Israel's Mossad. Not once, but twice in a very short period. Open Hands divulged private information about one of the most private people in the world, the head of Israel's clandestine intelligence service. Mossad head David Barnea and his private phone number and salary were published. The material was from Barnea's 2020 tax return. He makes, by the way, according to this, $268,000. Israel's response was that the hack was actually material that was made public and it's irrelevant and not of any use to anyone today. That material came from Barnea's wife's old cell phone. Because the material on Telegraph disappears so quickly, finding the culprits is very difficult. We know it was Open Hands because the group is actually a loosely connected group of hackers and varied political ideologies and goals because they actually claimed responsibility for the deed. Israel is obviously a target of hackers, and this is just one of many examples. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the Israeli Knesset. In the course of his presentation, the Ukrainian president was speaking. The Knesset was forced to repel computer attack after computer attack. Almost certainly the attacks on the Knesset were an attempt to prevent Ukrainian president's speech. The cyber attacks could have resulted in a disaster, but the Israeli cyber defense system was alert and they did their job, and the speech went on as it should have. The attackers were most probably Russian. In his speech, Zelensky made reference to the Holocaust, a decision that was met with serious critique. The general feeling of the Knesset members and many Israelis was that the Ukrainian president's Holocaust-related material bordered on Holocaust denial. Most specifically, his use of historical comparisons and exaggerations he employed when comparing the murder of the Jews by the Nazis to the Russian invasion of his country, Ukraine. The Holocaust was perpetrated under the guise of war. It was a program to murder every single Jew, and to that end, murder factories were created. The end result was the murder of 6 million Jews. Israeli lawmakers and Holocaust experts contend that that is not what is happening in Ukraine. Nevertheless, almost every member of Knesset, almost everyone, agreed to support Ukraine against an aggressive Russia. Citizen Brick is the name of a company that creates customized Lego characters. They create and personalize spectacular different characters for the classic children's game Lego. There is a new addition to their Lego collections. It's Lego Zelensky. Lego Zelensky is now able to play along with police and firefighters as well as figures of construction workers and various other family members. Along with Zelensky, Citizen Brick made a Molotov cocktail figurine also. There is an option to buy both figures, or to choose either the president or the firebomb. The Chicago-based Citizen Brick created these figures not as a business venture, but as a humanitarian gesture, and they wanted to raise $100,000 to help Ukrainian refugees through the organization Direct Relief. They sold out within 24 hours. It is important to note that Citizen Brick is not the Lego Group. It's a company licensed to produce specialized additions to the game. And given the response, these figures are a welcome addition. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. We discussed the idea of justice and war crimes. The Jewish system of courts and law are based on that premise. In this world, justice is achieved and evil is punished by earthly courts. But there's another layer added to that system of justice. There is also a heavenly court. And according to Jewish tradition, just like earthly courts, the heavenly court also punishes. That understanding has enabled, empowered Jews throughout their history of suffering and persecutions to forge forward and continue to build and create and celebrate despite the constant attacks against them. They know that evil will ultimately not go unpunished, and goodness will in the end always triumph. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.